Welcome back, students, parents, and teachers, to the Science of Sport webinar series. My name is Daren Heaton. I'm the Executive Director with Science of Sport. My co-host is Dr. Ricardo Valerdi, who is an engineering professor at the University of Arizona and the founder of Science of Sport. For today's episode, we're focusing on air pressure and as that relates to a number of different sports. But for the goal for this at-home STEM activity is really to help parents and teachers with some additional educational resources that they can use during this time in order to supplement some online learning courses or just for some additional activities that they can do that reinforce STEM. Science of Sport is a nonprofit organization that develops STEM curriculum and provides a number of different programs throughout the country. For today's episode, we are going to spotlight the Dallas Mavericks. We have a really cool program with them. It focuses on basketball, and since we're talking about air pressure, it's a great program to spotlight. They also have a number of different resources, free lessons, videos on their website that you can access right now to use at home. As you can see on the slide here is the program that we have with the Mavs. The link below, you can just type in Mavs Science of Basketball. It should pop up for you, but a lot of really cool resources for you there. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Zoom chat, which is at the bottom of the page, or if you're following us on Facebook Live, throw them in the comments there. But for today's episode, again, we're focusing on air pressure. Ricardo, can you tell us a little bit more about it? Ricardo, you're on mute.
Thank you. Before I get into the content, I wanted to show you the Mavs webpage that you just pointed out, because it has a lot of really good resources. It has some videos. It has some worksheets on the bottom that are free to download. And then, of course, it contains the link to this and future webinars. So it's a really good resource. Please take advantage of it, because the Knicks are doing their best to provide, the Mavericks are doing their best to provide all these community resources to you for free. Okay, so let's get into the topic of air pressure. And I wanted to just share with you that the very basic materials that you need are a basketball, an air pump, and a tape measure. And the air pump can be just a standard air pump for a sporting basketball or a soccer ball or a volleyball. But in some cases, you might be able to get your hands on an air pump with a gauge on it. And that's extra helpful. If you don't have an air pump with a gauge, it's not the end of the world, but it can help you get a more accurate measurement. So when you think about air pressure in the sport of basketball, it's really important, because one of the rules of basketball is that in order to run forward, in order to move, you have to be dribbling the basketball. And this becomes a big deal, because when that basketball touches the floor, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of different forces that are acted upon it. And so the diagram here on the right give you some idea of the various forces in play. But one of those things that determines how much a basketball will bounce is whether it is properly inflated. And that's what we're going to talk about today, to be able to define what proper inflation does, and then be able to test whether a basketball is properly inflated.
Ricardo, let's talk a little bit about the science aspects, though, before you get into this. Elasticity, can you talk a little bit about that as it relates to the basketball?
Yes, of course. So it's a great point. Elasticity is how quickly an object returns to its original form. And in the case of basketball, elasticity is important because the bounciness of the ball determines a lot of things. For instance, if you think about when the basketball gets shot up towards the rim or towards the backboard, how quickly it bounces off, if it's a brick shot or if it's a bank shot. The response that the basketball surfaces is extremely important for a player's touch. So
Ricardo, are you there? Looks like we lost you a little bit. Looks like he's dealing with some Wi-Fi. No worries.
all right.
He's back.
I'm back. Sorry. So that was a long explanation regarding elasticity, but I wanted just to reiterate the fact that elasticity is how quickly an object returns to its original shape. So how bouncy it is relative to the surfaces that it's hitting. So in terms of basketball, it's important to remember how air pressure is measured. So this is an image of an air pump with a gauge on it, and you'll see that it's labeled PSI here towards the left side of this gauge. And the gauge goes all the way up from 0 all the way up to 30. In the case of basketball, we're only worried about small values because most basketballs only need to be inflated between 7 and 9 pounds per square inch. So that's an important unit of measure to remember because that's what governs whether a basketball is properly inflated. And I wanted to show you a basketball here because once you have a basketball in your hand, you're actually able to look at the label of the basketball right where the pump, and there's a bunch of writing around it, and that's where you can see the ratings of 7 to 9 PSI. So if you look at a soccer ball or a volleyball, they are all labeled appropriately to tell you what the proper air. So I wanted to explain the experiment in 5 steps. Step number 1 is you need, and you'll see in this picture, we're doing this experiment with 3 people, okay? The first person is going to hold the tape measure vertically. And this is important because then that becomes the reference point at which you're measuring everything. The second step involves holding the basketball at a height of 72 inches, which is the same thing as 6 feet. So the bottom of the basketball needs to be at that height. The fourth step is involving the third person, and this happens to be me. You can see that I have both of my hands there to the side of the tape measure, and I'm making sure that I'm measuring the minimum bounce and the maximum bounce, which are 54 inches and 49 inches, okay? So you want to measure to make sure that the ball bounces no more than 54 inches, but no less than 49 inches, okay? And the measurement that you're making, though, is for the top of the basketball. So that's an important thing to reiterate is when you first drop it in step 3, you're measuring the bottom of the basketball. But when you measure the first bounce, you change by now measuring the top of the basketball. So you want to try this experiment a few times. Maybe try it by underinflating the basketball, and you'll notice that it won't bounce as high. Then you want to try maybe overinflating the basketball, and then you'll notice that it will bounce much higher than 54 inches. And then you want to inflate the basketball within the recommended range, which is 7 to 9 PSI. And that will confirm with you that the ball is accurately or inflated to regulation, and the top of the ball should land somewhere between 54 and 49. What do you think, Daren? You've done this before a few times, right?
Yeah, I have done it a couple different times. And one aspect that I think you could make it into an experiment would be to not only drop the basketball, maybe you don't have a pump and a gauge. So what if you were to drop just a tennis ball, a baseball, a basketball, and or wiffle ball, and measuring how high the bounce was for each of those. So I'm just thinking of a couple different variations that you can take it if you are at home during this time and don't have some of these different resources. But at least that's where my mind is going. Just similar to what we did with the sink or float, you were using a bunch of different types of balls. You could use a bunch of different types of balls for this activity, right?
That's right, and you could actually drop them all from the same height and measure the height of the first bounce, and you'll be able to see to compare the different elasticities of, say, a tennis ball or a golf ball or a soccer ball, and that would tell you something about how elastic each of those objects is. I should also reiterate, though, is that the surface that you're bouncing the ball, that you're dropping the ball into, matters a whole lot. So carpet is typically not very good. You usually want a hard surface like concrete or wood or tile, as long as it's smooth and you can get a consistent and reliable bounce. I don't recommend grass. I don't recommend carpet because you get inconsistent results. So I just wanted to reiterate here the various PSI rates. So if you overinflate the basketball, that would be a high bounce. If you properly inflate it between 7 and 9 PSI, then that will be a proper bounce within regulation. Life is good. But if you, I'm sorry, this is a typo. This should say if the PSI is less than 7, you will get a low bounce. Daren?
So is there an advantage? I mean, it might be a dumb question, but is there an advantage to having it a high bounce or low bounce, maybe also within other sports as it relates to the amount of air that you put into a ball? Maybe a volleyball or a football. How does that compare?
Are you suggesting that the New England Patriots didn't adequately inflate the footballs?
No comment. I would just like to, experiment and learn more. If there's an advantage, if a football is not inflated a certain amount, or maybe a volleyball is overinflated?
I mean, I certainly think in sports where there's a lot of bounce, that would matter a lot. So soccer, volleyball, basketball. In football, it could matter maybe if you're trying to kick the ball, right? So if you've underinflated a football and you're trying to kick it, it's not going to go very far. And so I think it really depends also on the temperature, because it actually turns out that because of Bernoulli's equation, I'm getting super nerdy now, but Bernoulli's equation actually relates air pressure with temperature. And so in some cases, if it's colder or if it's warmer, it will affect the air pressure inside the ball.
So there's an advantage to that playing in cold weather or hot weather, or?
Well, I think, again, it depends on what you're doing with the ball. So if you're throwing it, like Tom Brady was, throwing footballs, I think the argument could be made that if you maybe underinflate the ball, maybe it's easier to catch to a certain extent. If you overdo it, it's just a wobbly piece of leather or piece of rubber. So maybe there's a certain threshold that if you go below a certain PSI, the ball is really not going to be throwable or kickable.
Great. Okay. Well, to me, there's two different ways that you could, do this at-home STEM activity. One is with a basketball in which you are going to be measuring the PSI and dropping that basketball from a certain height and seeing how high the basketball will bounce. And then there's a second component in which you're able to incorporate a number of different variations of balls, whether that's a baseball, tennis ball, golf ball, and doing a little experiment to compare each of the heights that those balls bounce. And, really, we would love to hear any other ways that you're able to incorporate a activity at home that reinforces air pressure, elasticity, and really just kinetic and potential energy. So Ricardo, on this slide, we have a number of our different social media pages. Thanks for putting that up. You'll see our YouTube page, in which we have some more resources that include all of our webinars from the past couple of weeks and some short 2-minute step-by-step videos. What's next Thursday's or this Thursday's session about?
Yeah, this Thursday's webinar is going to be about geometry. So we're going to be looking at geometry of different sports and and kind of how geometry has to be considered. And there's actually an interesting connection to air pressure, because if you think about it, balls that have greater elasticity, in other words, they go a further distance when they're hit, are associated with sports that have a larger playing area. So think golf, think baseball, large playing areas. And sports that are played in smaller spaces like basketball or volleyball, they don't have as much of elasticity, but they also have heavier objects. So there's actually an interesting relationship between the size of the playing area in which the sport is played and the elasticity and the weight of the ball that's used.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Well, I look forward to taking a deeper dive into that on Thursday. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@sciencesport.org. You'll see it on the slide here. That's it for today's at-home STEM activity. Thanks for joining. We'll see you on Thursday.